Go for it.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever in the heck in the world you are. It's the one, the only, the notorious one, V the Guerrilla Economist, coming to you live on another edition of Rogue Money Radio with my main man CJ working the airwaves in the background, making sure this broadcast is coming out absolutely crispy and clean. With that being said, we have a special, very, very uber special broadcast for you guys today. We have none other than Hugo Feugen. And Hugo is the author of the book, The Fuddy Hoax. Okay, some of you remember who Loretta Fuddy was. Some of you might not remember. This is a key event that you guys are going to be really, really blown away mentally speaking. Because, as of, I say late 2016, many of us became very aware of a term that insiders have been using for many, many, many decades, and that is called the deep state. Okay, we have a deep state in effect. You're going to see how nefarious this deep state is. You're going to see the collusion with very high powers, with very high-ranking individuals, and how are they able to affect perception? How are they able to affect public thinking and thought? And Hugo's going to break that down for us. We also have our infamous W. He is also joined with us, and he is a good friend of Hugo's as well. And they're both going to break down from an engineering and scientific standpoint what this whole entire thing is, the greater agenda that is at play. Now, Hugo Feugen has been a successful CEO or president of the 3 different aviation simulation-related companies. Mr. Feugen was CEO of BAO Ltd., the Champaign, Illinois-based developer of my favorite all-time computer flight simulator called Microsoft Flight Simulator, the most popular computer entertainment software title ever, which has sold many millions. Mr. Feugen has logged over 2,500 hours of flight experience and over 450 hours as a certified instrument flight instructor. Mr. Feugen holds a single-engine land and multi-engine land certificate, Class 2 medical, as well as repairman certificates for his experimental Lancair 320, which has been flying for more than 26 years. For 8 years, Mr. Feugen served as safety officer for the EngineAires Aero Club, a group of 30 pilots that together own 3 Piper Archer IIs, four-place, 180 horsepower, single-engine, reciprocating, propeller-driven aircraft. His website is thefuddyhoax.com. That is DFUDDY hoax.com. You can see his most recent interviews also on YouTube as well. We're going to be doing something special as well. As Hugo's speaking, we're going to be going through slides. And so you listeners, while you watch this video, you guys could go through these slides. You can pause it at any point during the interview, okay? And you could look at the evidence that Hugo and W are bringing forth. With that being said, without further ado, Hugo, thank you for this momentous occasion that you joined us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Appreciate being here.
It's our honor and our privilege.
Yeah,
W,
very
stop
good.
breathing. I love you, man. I love you.
Let's start at
Well, I don't want to
slide
stop
11.
breathing. I just want to stop making weird noises.
That's it. And I know it's early for you out there, man. And you're in somewhere in the Pacific Ocean right about now, and you submerged. So.
Well, I am not in the ocean today. I am on the ocean, but I'm not in the ocean. So it's a beautiful sunny day, and the seals are out the back of the boat here, and so we're having a nice morning.
Hey, that's good, man. God bless. Hugo, welcome aboard, sir.
Thank you. Let's go to slide 11.
Fantastic.
Now, this is a collage of several different pictures. The bottom 2 are from the photographer who happened to be flying by. He took pictures of the ditched aircraft shortly after it went down. And it shows that the aircraft is actually very close to shore. We've measured that in terms of in the Google Maps and Google Earth. And also in the lower right, it shows that it was 13.5 wingspans of a Cessna Grand Caravan. So that totals up to be 234 yards from shore. And yet the representation by the participants and the NTSB, no less, suggests that this aircraft went down in the open ocean. And in the upper left, you see representation made that it was a mile offshore. So the representations just are very different from what the physical evidence tells us. physical evidence, again, 234 yards from shore, and they're saying it's a mile. And
Wow.
there are other reports of being a half mile, and certainly in the open ocean, somehow the NTSB can't even get it right. So that's kind of a problem. Let's go to slide 35, where we see that here's another, it's the enlargement of the lower left picture we just saw. And that distance is actually something that any of the participants, even without a life jacket, a beginner swimmer, could have made it to shore in less than 7 minutes. And yet, what really happened was that all of the participants were left out on the water to be there an average of 100 minutes. So instead of dog paddling to shore, they were left out there for 100 minutes on average. Now, this is, some people will say, well, stay with the aircraft for heaven's sake. So, well, actually, the pilot told the people to get away from the airplane. So it's only reasonable that if they were away from the airplane that they would make their way to shore, especially when we see very shortly that this entire area was very, very shallow. If you look at, well, let's go back to slide 11 for just a moment. In the upper right of that slide, we'll see that there's a bathymetry map, and that yellow arrow shows us where the craft went down relative to the shore. And there are a couple of items there in the shallow area. It shows that entire blue area, blue shaded area, was less than 10 meters deep, which means 33 feet or less. But right next to the tip of that yellow arrow, we see a little circle and a 1 next to it. That means at that area, the water was only 1 meter deep.
Oh, wow.
So everyone would have been waist-high water, essentially. And the asterisk below it means that there are outcroppings of the ocean floor in that area. So really, this is a very shallow area. And we'll see that being relevant again and again. So let's go back to slide 35A this time. Now, when we asked the Navy, we made a FOIA request of them, whether there were any U.S. Navy, Marine Corps, or SEAL watercraft on that date in that area. We didn't make any mention of the downing, but the Pacific Fleet in response said, we confirmed that there were no PAC fleet ships in the area of the crash, and that no PAC fleet ships were contacted or involved in the search and rescue operations related to the crash. Now, we hadn't mentioned anything about the crash, and we certainly hadn't restricted our request to being only about ships. And thirdly, we didn't restrict the information to being just about search and rescue operations. So what the Navy apparently was doing was using weasel words to minimize the response to that. But we see out there in this picture just happens to be something. And what we have recorded is the Molokai Tower operator saying that he's received, well, actually it was the U.S. Coast Guard Command C-130 that reported when he entered the area that he saw both the aircraft and a rescue boat in sight. Now, there's no other boat anywhere other than that little thing at the end of the red arrow. Now, what in the world is that?
Yeah, what is that?
So we actually know a bit about things like that. And if you go to the next slide, say 35C, let's try that one. It'll show us that it fits the dimensions and the requirements for depth of a what we call a SEAL or a swimmer delivery vehicle. And that particular one in the upper left has about an 8-foot draft and a 4-foot by 5-foot by 5-foot conning tower and periscope and radio tower there. Those are indicative of SEALs. That is, U.S. Navy SEALs use that kind of a vehicle to get where they're going. They don't jump out of airplanes into the water. They they use this kind of swimmer delivery vehicle. Let's go now to 36, slide 36. And we see, after we honed our request from the Navy, we got two different responses roughly 26 months after the crash, a mere 26 months. And it tells us that actually there were ships in the area. And so they changed their story. There were two destroyers there, the USS Halsey and USS O'Kane. And coincidentally, both of those destroyers could land in a pad that they had on the back side of that, those destroyers. The very Seahawk that also was present at the ditching. And secondly, we got from the submarine command word that there was a submarine, just one of those coincidentally that had a dry deck shelter and was outfitted for a swimmer delivery vehicle. So that's all very, very coincidental.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, they say, pretty much everything is classified. We're not going to tell you. So the only thing we were supposed to learn from that was that it was the USS La Jolla. Everything else was classified. So,
and let me add this, Hugo, the number of subs in the entire U.S. Navy set up with a dry deck for swimmer delivery vehicles at that time in history, I believe it was only two, one in the Pacific and one in the Atlantic. And so it's not like we have dozens of subs set up this way. There may be some other subs that are set up that we're unaware of or something, but it's not every sub. This is only a couple of subs on the whole planet. And one of them is just mere mile or two from where this accident occurred.
Yeah.
Wow.
You can look at the next slide, 37, and we'll see that the assignment area for the La Jolla, coincidentally that day, and that day newly, that is, it wasn't just hanging around here for days and days, but it was assigned just this day, just a few miles off the coast there, north of Molokai in the Hawaiian Islands. So the swimmer delivery vehicle would have made the last 3 or 4 or 5 miles there to the island. So everything is in place, and even though they tried to hide it originally, we finally got the real scoop, because if they hadn't disclosed that, they could have been subject to even further problems. But moving to the next slide, 38, we see at the bottom particularly is an excerpt from the National Traffic Manager's log at the FAA Honolulu Control Center. And there's a special ops section in that manager's log, and it's typically used for naval or military operations. You'll see special ops there listed, and several of those lines have been redacted. Well, that middle line, the second line, indicates that there's a airspace reservation between 24,000 and 27,000 feet. And it just happens to be in the exact hour that the Fuddy hoax was to take place. That is, the departure was for 3:15 in the afternoon, Hawaii Standard Time. And that Zulu time span, the 12th between 0100 and 0200, that's the exact hour in which this flight would have taken off. So it's more than coincidental, and it's more than coincidental that it would be redacted, what essentially amounts to national security purposes there. So we see a lot of things that come together, converge, and we'll see in pictures later that there was probable communication with the people out on the water. There's a lot of evidence of that. We can go back to slide 12 for a moment. And that was the excerpt we saw earlier in a small portion. This time it's enlarged a little bit. The upper left there shows what very vaguely looks like it might be the outline of an airplane sitting in the water. But in fact, we have actually the original source frame from which that was taken. Kind of looks like a Cessna. Can you see that? Does anybody else see that?
Yeah.
But if you go to slide 13, you'll see the source image from which that came, even though it says it was an aerial view of the crash site. We know what that was, and it was not an aerial view of the crash. It was actually an image of a U.S. Coast Guard Dolphin helicopter. It's in the upper right portion of that frame. And then there's the rotor downwash, and then there was a smoke float onto the water. So it's very coincidental that the owner of the airline claimed that that was a mile out, and that might have been the crash site. But in fact, what it was a place that we know that what happened at that time. That is, it was the U.S. Coast Guard helicopter picking up whatever Fuddy was at that time. That is, this was a mile out from shore, indeed a mile out from where the ditching occurred, and it was whatever Fuddy was at that point. Now, we think that that was not the real Ms. Fuddy, but anyway, it happens to be that last pickup of the day. All the other passengers had been picked up, and Ms. Fuddy had been left there in the water by the first rescue helicopter that approached her. And the only way he could have, that is, the rescue swimmer could have left her in the water, is if she had been obviously dead. So there's a real big discrepancy about that. That is, she was left in the water for dead, and then 40 minutes later, the second helicopter comes and gets her. This is that second helicopter. And as it goes on to the airport at Kalaupapa, as it's flying there, it makes the claim that as the rescuers aboard that helicopter said that her condition was critical. So how she
dead and critical at the same time.
Yeah, let's pause for a second. Let me just back up here, because Hugo's doing an awesome job of laying this out. But there's two facts for the audience that they need to be aware of. Number one, the reason that the location of the crash closer to shore or further away is relevant legally is that inside of a half a mile, I believe it is, or maybe a quarter mile, I can't remember off the top of my head, quarter mile, the Maui Police Department would have been had it in their jurisdiction to investigate a death or murder. Outside of that distance, it would have then gone to other agencies. The other thing is that, so by saying it was a mile offshore, the local police department has no jurisdiction to investigate any aspect of the death or crash, etc. Then the other thing is, with the situation with Fuddy herself, saying that she was way offshore when she was picked up and she was just a dead body. Well, why would she be last? Because the diver that got in the water initially and came to her has to do an analysis. He's doing triage on the overall crash site and prioritizing which people to assist and which people not to take time with at that instant to decide, where their efforts should be right off the bat. And he supposedly had determined that she was already dead at that point in time, or not savable, based on her appearance, and so went to the other people. And so she would have been the last person pulled out of the water because she was already dead at that point in time. And since everybody else was really not in a in stress, major stress, threat of life, we know that just because they all survived, and we know what the conditions were when they were reported out. It's hard to imagine that the diver would make any kind of a mistake. This U.S. Navy SEAL diver that has medical training experience. I should say maybe it's a Coast Guard, I believe. Was that
Right.
the case?
Yes.
Yeah. And so, but with training in exactly this area, it's implausible to imagine that the diver could have made any type of a mistake in this matter. And Hugo, you know what the requirements, what the diver has to make his assessment on.
Yes, he particularly said he touched and shook her, and protocol said move on. Now, the only way he could do that is if he determined that she was obviously dead. So he didn't give her CPR, which would have been his other responsibility if she had been anything other than that, or if he would know that she might have been there for less than 10 minutes, for example. Nor did he hoist her into his craft. So he very specifically said protocol meant move on. So we know that protocol, we have it in the book, and it's very detailed, and we believe he was an excellent swimmer rescuer. So the only thing that could possibly have meant was he determined that what he faced was obviously dead.
Wow.
Are you ready? W?
Go ahead. And I just wanted to slow things down at that one point so that listeners grasp that, you know, she's dead. Well, then all of a sudden she's in the helicopter minutes later, you know, what, half an hour later?
And they're reporting her as
well, yeah, 40 minutes later, she was picked up by the second helicopter. And at that point in time, as they're moving towards shore, which would have only taken a minute and a half or so, she was assessed to be critical. So how she could have gone from obviously dead to critical is pretty unusual.
It's a miracle.
Yeah, I think maybe that's why this frame was taken and was included in the U.S. Coast Guard's video reportage of the event that they made that evening. So even though it's unlabeled and unnarrated, it has this picture at the beginning.
Sure.
I can imagine that they're looking at this and saying, this is proof of their ability to bring people back to life. I don't know. She was dead, but she came back to life.
Wow.
And of course, the Obama healthcare plan should have whatever it was they were giving her as something they should give all the rest of us too.
Yeah.
Now, W had said that if she was outside the quarter-mile boundary, which is the boundary for both Maui County and for, well, technically Kalawao County and Maui County responsibility. If she had been outside of that, which also is the border for Hawaii State, it would have been the FBI's responsibility. But what we see happening, or that is not happening, is that none of these agencies did any investigation whatsoever. So that's a big anomaly. That is, neither the Maui County Fire Department, the police department, or the FBI did any investigation of any death in this instance. Now, we know this was a planned event. And if there's a death, that can only mean, frankly, that she was murdered. But we don't believe that either.
Right, okay.
Now, if we move to slide 14, what we see is an enhanced satellite view top down in this area close to shore within where we saw that bathymetry map showing us everything is less than 10 meters deep. That aircraft image on the far right side is actually a photoshopped image of an approximation of where the craft went down. But what we see particularly of interest underwater is that there are these underwater pools. So there's hugely shallow areas, particularly on the lower left of that slide. And yet there are these pools underneath the water. So a videographer could take video and it would look like people were treading water and getting tired and all of this kind of nonsense. When in fact, they could have been standing on the edges of these pools in as little as 1 meter deep water, which is, as we saw, identified to be right near where the craft went down.
Wow.
I think I've got a picture of that. Maybe I don't. Well, maybe we'll find it later. But we have images of that aircraft as it sat ditched. And it shows that one wing was down and the other wing was up. So it looks very much like it was teetering on a fulcrum. So we'll see that somewhere in our, certainly in the book. I would encourage your readers to go look there. But let's move on to slide 15 for a moment. And what we see,
and the reason that's important for your listeners is that means that the aircraft, when it hit, the water was so shallow, it grounded out. And we also know that because there was damage inside the cabin from the deflection of the landing gear into the cabin, the plane hit the water in very shallow water. So just because you see water there doesn't mean that the plane's about to sink or anything like that. It's sitting on the edge of a pool in the water, and it's landed relatively pretty precisely for that location. Part of the reason that we think it has damage with the gear deflected is at the last moment, in order to make sure that the aircraft landed exactly where they wanted it to, the pilot had to adjust the attitude of the aircraft because he was going to sail a little bit past that point. There's an effect called a ground effect with aircraft. As you get closer to the surface, the air builds up underneath, piles up, and it can make you sail a little bit further than you think. And so he had to override that to get the aircraft to stop exactly where they wanted it. This was a highly specific location that they had planned for this staging of this event.
Let's look at slide 10 on that. We see that even though the NTSB made the claim that the plane impacted the water at a wings level, slightly nose high attitude, that contradicts the evidence that we have. This image here is the frame immediately before everything goes sideways, that is splashing all over the place. In other words, it's the last good frame of video before the ditching. And we see that the plane is clearly in a 20-degree left bank, and that the attitude of the nose is downward. So it didn't happen the way the NTSB said. And we think that the pilot was trying to go for a particular place. Otherwise, it would not be safe to do what he just did in this frame. And we know one of the passengers, actually a Green Beret or a former Green Beret, said the plane came to an abrupt stop. So it's not like this billowy open ocean splash like you might expect to find at Universal Studios. That witness, a very capable witness, experienced former military, said it was an abrupt stop. And as Wayne mentioned, we know that the left gear contacted something, because the seat closest to that attach point in the aircraft, that seat and that seat only broke off from the floor and threw the passenger there onto the floor. Fortunately, her husband was able to attend to her quickly, but that was the only seat to be broken off that way. So we know that something dramatic happened at that point, and all the evidence circumstantially leads towards saying it must have hit something on the ocean floor, and that's confirmed by the bathymetry map as well. So, but we can go back for a moment to slide 15.
And you have to remember, the aircraft is extremely strong in that landing gear area. This is almost the strongest area of the aircraft. So to have any damage from that means you hit something very hard. And when they say it stopped quickly, I'll bet it did, because the energy involved to cause that deflection there was pretty massive.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
What we have in slide 15 here is two different images, both purportedly of the same engine area and propeller. The one on the left was taken immediately after the ditching. There was a videographer who was shooting video as he went along. And what we see there is the underwater image of the engine with the cowling thrown off. And notice the one propeller blade up to the right is fairly unbent, we'll say. We can't quite see all angles to that, but generally it looks relatively unbent, particularly compared with the other blade, the down low one, the one to which the orange arrow was pointing. It has been bent back severely, and it appears to be contacting the left side of the nose gear strut. So that bend backwards is worth 2.5, 3 feet maybe of backward bend. But when we get the aircraft coming out of the water on the barge a week later, which is an image on the right, what we see is 3 different propeller blades that are not bent like anything like the underwater lowest propeller blade. Now that underwater lowest propeller blade tells us, particularly the differential bending, means that the prop was stopped. It was not turning as it hit the water, but that blade that was bent back was probably stopped at the lowest position or nearly there and bending back because of the strong resistive force of the water at that point. Where by the time the airplane settled into the water, the upper blade there to the right did not have as much resistive force from the water coming at it. So it got much less bent. But at the right, all of those blades are in the same prop disc plane. So we have literally evidence to suggest that we have two different engines here. It wouldn't be possible to change out a propeller on the ocean floor. And this image on the right is purportedly just after it's been raised from the floor. The NTSB tells us that the engine was found separated on the ocean floor already from the firewall and from the fuselage. So the representation is that this has to be the same engine, but it cannot be because we have different prop blade bends. And no matter what sloshing happens on the ocean floor, whether it's knocking around in a storm or whatever, it's not going to unbend nicely to appear as one of those three blades at right. So frankly, there's a lot of evidence right there to tell us we're looking at two different engines. Now, if that
only... let me just add this, Hugo, too, and not to interrupt your flow, but it is an important point. Sure. The strongest places on the aircraft, the landing gear and the mount location for the engine itself, the stresses in that overall airframe that have to be able to be absorbed and to keep it together. Those are the two places that you have to have high strength. So the idea that that engine, either by sloshing around on the ocean floor or an impact or something like that, would break away from the airplane, absolutely insane, ridiculous. Every place else on the airplane would come apart before that engine would come off of the firewall. To say that that engine was separate from the body, the fuselage of that aircraft, from sloshing around in the water out there, even if you had hurricane force winds beating around, defies logic. It's a very, very, very strong mount location, multiple locations of mounts.
What
never
Toby
happened.
is saying is certainly true, but if there were any scintilla of evidence to suggest what the NTSB came up with was correct, we could look at the breakage of those mounts and see what kind of breakage they endured. Was it bending back and forth? Was it high stress impact? What kind of breakage did those mounts endure? Now, this was purported to have been a natural phenomenon of rolling around on the uneven floor rocks. That was what the NTSB had said. But we're going to find that those, frankly, were lies. And that's most disconcerting to me, especially as an aviation guy, that the NTSB would resort to lies. But don't let me just say that. Let me prove that.
Gentlemen, isn't also the engines on these aircraft, aren't these like part of like a stressed member of the entire airframe?
Well, as Wayne said, this is really powerful, strong stuff. It doesn't bend and break with anything, even a hurricane force. That's not going to be the first thing that breaks.
Let's put it this way, V, you could put the area where the engine's mounted to the rest of the fuselage, you could put it in huge metal bending presses. Yeah. And you could bend it up like a pretzel and eventually get it maybe to tear or stretch or deflect. But it's specifically designed, even the bolts doing the connection are designed to stretch before they break. They don't snap because that's not what you want it to do. You want it to be able to take energy and still hold and deflect, but not go apart. But even if you did that, even if you rolled this thing around, that whole airframe would look like a pretzel long before those engine mount locations would come loose. And for those engineers out there that want to say, no, that's not true. Yes, there is breakaway bolts on jet engines that are mounted so that the engine can, if it has a problem, break away and get away from the wing without tearing the rest of the aircraft apart. But that's not the case in this type of an aircraft in these types of mounts.
Correct.
You know, what you would expect to see is actually the firewall and the engine and its mounting together. That is, the breakage would occur behind the firewall. There are far less strength-filled members beyond the firewall that is closer to the engine or the cabin than between the firewall and the engine itself. Those mountings should have endured everything here. And yet we see many mount members have somehow given way. We'll see that in just a minute, but if everyone's done with that comment, we'll go to slide 16. What we see here in that last frame, you saw the upper right propeller image underwater, and we've chosen several different frames of image of those propeller blade, I call them blade tip paint scheme or paint pattern. Brought those up. Those are the blue images between the lower row of black and white propeller blade paint pattern. And what I've done is I've compared an image that we saw in the upper right there of the barge-based propeller and its paint scheme, which is there at its upper right, that paint pattern, and compared it to the underwater paint pattern of the propeller that was still attached to the airplane after it ditched. And what we see is there seems to be consistently a much wider space between the two white areas on the propeller tip. The one we find on the barge has a nice wide black area, but the one underwater has a fairly narrow area. And in fact, I contacted the NTSB thinking that they were all white hats and they were my friends and all this kind of thing. And I said, you know, this suggests that there's two different propellers down there. And two different propellers means it's two different engines. And I think they took my comments to heart. But we'll see that in a minute. Let's go to the next slide, 17. Now, we talked about the mountings from this engine, the engine mount members to the firewall. They should have endured some kind of strong stresses. And indeed, we see several strong bashings, if you will, on many places on the engine. And yet, if you look at that green arrow on the upper right, we're looking at something that cannot have been simply from rolling around on the rocks. In fact, it looks like it was a jaws of life kind of thing, a snipping of that very sturdy mount member. So even though you have breakage, there's an unusual kind of breakage that looks like it might be man-made. Now we have a witness, as actually brought to us by Jerome Corsi, the noted author, who said he had a witness who told him, he was on the barge for the salver, the folks who brought the aircraft and the engine up from the water, from the ocean floor. He said they had a machine on board the aircraft that actually crunched and made this damage on that engine. So that's in part kind of believable.
Not on the aircraft, on the salvage barge.
Yes, I'm sorry. It was on this machine would have been on the salvage barge where the witness was a hired hand, apparently.
Got it.
Now, if you go to the next frame, slide 18, you'll see that we have just many mount members which don't have twisting and breakage. What we have are saw cuts, particularly, say, those lower three at the bottom. You see those really sturdy mount members? Those are straight line saw cuts. They are not the bending of rolling around in a hurricane on the ocean floor. Those are straight line saw cuts. The left upper two as well, hugely strong mount members, just plain sawed off. There to the left, upper left, those are saw cuts. And the only way there can be saw cuts is a human intervention. This is not a natural phenomenon. The upper right ones as well, more saw cuts. There are saw cuts literally all over this engine. All of those arrows point to saw cuts. And at the lower left there on the far left side, you see the engine mount bracket. It's a beefy portion. And yet there's a clean breakage from those bolts that would have had to apparently shear. There's no bolt that remains in those holes. Now we understand that those bolts particularly would not have been the kind of bolts that would shear, but in fact would have stretched. So under even the worst circumstances, we would expect to see remaining portions of bolts on the engine side. But even though the engine came down, or the aircraft came down in roughly 80 knots of flight speed against the water, we saw in that previous picture underwater that the nose gear strut was apparently entirely intact, not bent out of its normal position at all. So how underwater, 25 feet or so underwater, how it would have endured even a stronger stress than 80 knots of resistance against the water as it was flying is just beyond incredible. And not to have left any bolts, but in fact, what we can surmise, jumping ahead with some other evidence just to tantalize people, is the fact that the nose gear strut must have been taken off manually is the only way this could have happened. But there's other evidence to support that thought. We can move on for the present. If we look at slide 19, we'll see cuts on the firewall. Those arrows on the left, upper left, are from the firewall, and they too have saw cuts all over the place. So it can only be said, because we know the NTSB to be filled with competent people, and they had a team of investigators working on this, and they would have all peer-reviewed this evidence. We know they're not incompetent, so how could they dare sign their name, put their name on this kind of falsified evidence that is completely contrary to what's obviously available to them in the photographic evidence? Again, on the right side, you see more orange arrows. Well, that's just more saw cuts that disprove this rolling around on the ocean floor theory. We can move to the next image. And we see another NTSB image from the factual report. In fact, this image is the only one in the entire report that has a blade tip paint pattern. And you see it there slightly to the right of middle from that blade that seems to be sticking out from the tire, as it were. Now we know the engine is actually on the far side of that tire. We see a couple of people looking at it, but that's what's inset enlarged there on the right side. And what we see happening unusually, even though most of the image, that is 85% of the image, is just nicely in focus and so forth, one portion of that image is out of focus. In fact, it seems to have a double exposure, and that's the back side of the engine. That's furthermore supported by the guy to the lower right of, or lower left of that image. You see, it's not just a shadow on the bulkhead wall, that's a color-filled image, so it's a double exposure going on. Somebody manually had to Photoshop a double exposure onto that engine such that we would be obscured, that is the citizenry and anyone who looks at this report is obscured from seeing the detail. But we already saw that detail a few photos back, which showed all of these saw cuts. So we know there was motivation or a reason that they would have had to obscure that evidence. If we look then at the blade tip paint pattern again, moving to the next slide, what we have here is a summary. In the upper left, the barge blade tip paint pattern that we saw, actually not from the NTSB, but another media source. That is, there were photographers from various media group who were invited to the salvage barge to take pictures and so forth. So I got that picture from someone other than the NTSB, but it shows a completely different paint pattern than the one we see at right, which came from the NTSB, the one with the red arrow at the far right. And again, the blade tip paint pattern is obscured from the images at the lower left. Those blades, even though they were shown in the NTSB report, none of them showed the blade tip paint pattern, as we do see in this one image on the right. If you go to the next slide, you'll see some anomalies. Well, I'm sorry, this is a different slide than I thought. What it was from the previous image, we took that blade tip paint pattern, the one with the red arrow, and we rotated it into place in place of that previous comparison where we used the upper left blade to do that comparison to the underwater blade tip paint patterns. So go ahead to that slide again, and we find that the narrower black portion actually is a much closer match to the underwater blade tip paint patterns that we see, probably clearest on the far right. That's a pretty close match. But how can that be? We know that all the blade tip paint patterns, at least the outer ones, these outer two that we're most concerned with, are all identical on all of the blade tips on a single propeller. There is just no variation. So how can one blade tip's paint pattern match fairly closely and the other blade tip paint pattern not match at all?
And let me just add this, Hugo, that on a blade tip on props, on one engine, all of the tips are going to be absolutely identical. But between engine to another engine, they might not be precisely identical. You know, props come in at different times, they're put on at different times. What we're showing here is that on each engine, they're slightly different, but measurably different, observably different, and you wouldn't be able to just change the prop in a few minutes, even under the water, with perfect conditions. It's a very complex process. These are two engines, and that's relevant because what engine was sent where to the NTSB to be tested to find out what actually happened. That's what we're getting to. That's where we're going with this. So go ahead, Hugo. I'm sorry.
That's not a problem at all. If we move to the next slide, we see another comparison. That is, there's a notch on that blade. We've zoomed into the NTSB image, and we see the red arrow at right pointing to a notch, which lets a heavy ship's pipe be seen from the back side. So we know there's a notch there. And yet in the upper left, the very same blade from the same propeller, ostensibly, that is both NTSB pictures, both of the same prop blade, that is what I've called the 8 o'clock blade when viewed from the front. On the front side, when looking at the blade tip paint pattern, you see a notch. When looking from the back side, there's no notch. So this is an internal inconsistency that cannot be. And when we see that kind of a thing in the modern day, all of our little hearts and minds go to the word Photoshop. But for the NTSB, possibly to Photoshop evidence is nothing less than, I would have to say, my belief is that's criminal.
Well, and let me ask you this, Hugo. You had made these inquiries before the final report was released.
Yes.
And of course, it's our contention that had you not made these inquiries, they might have released it not realizing that there was obvious things that were at odds here, but they were close enough to releasing the report that rather than take things out that had already been agreed amongst the rest of the staff, if you will, they left them in, but then photoshopped it or fudged it before releasing, because they were getting close to doing this, so that it was obscured. And so this, in part, was a direct response to your work and inquiries before you're doing the NTSB's work, before the NTSB even releases the report, because they're ignoring glaring, obvious inconsistencies.
Well, I can conjecture that. I really cannot dare go into their thinking and pretend I know, but certainly the residual of what happened suggests that there was some motivation to try to cover up this evidence, because if they didn't do that, it would be pretty clear that there were two different propellers. What they did made it somewhat appear that it might be the same propeller. So if I didn't have other media sourced images of that propeller, we'd have been sunken as far as proving this, probably. So that was, they may have thought they were successful doing this. All I can say is there's plenty of proof that they photoshopped this. And the coup de grace is actually in the next couple of slides. Let's go to them. Are we at 24? What we see here is an examination of the resolution of this digital image. And we have in all digital images what we call jaggies, that is, in the non-horizontal or vertical line edges, a stair-stepping. And that stair-stepping has to do with the resolution of the image. And so we see a characteristic stair-step in the rest of the image as shown by the yellow arrows. But what we see in the red arrow area, coincidentally, right on the edges of that propeller blade tip paint pattern, very, very low resolution stair stepping. And it suggests it might not be from the same image originally. Now, there's a lot of things wrong with that. The low resolution of that is indicative of photoshopping. If you look to the left, all of that low resolution scuffing on that blade is also indicative that we're looking at stuff that's of a different resolution than the rest of the photo. If we look at the black stripe, particularly on that blade tip, you see that the black tip top is narrower than the bottom blade tip top, or the bottom of that black stripe, which is actually the absence of paint, but nonetheless, it's wider at the bottom than it is at the top. So somebody didn't get it straight, and let me tell you, it'll always be straight on a real propeller. Furthermore, if you see the outer edge, the tip of that, the right edge of that 8 o'clock blade, it is fairly straight. And unfortunately, that black stripe is not parallel to the outer edge. And that just wouldn't happen. It does not happen that way. So you can see many evidences of photoshopping here. If you go to
so basically, this whole entire plane crash thing is a gigantic hoax. Okay, you've for the sake of time, we've got about 15 to 20 minutes or so left. Why don't you break down to us why? Why is this a big deal? Why go through all the resources, the personnel, the efforts, the horrible photoshopping, the hoax that is behind all this? Why? Who the hell is the question? Is Loretta Fuddy?
Well, it's not just Loretta Fuddy. It's this entire construct they've had of an ineligible president and the machinations they've already gone through to keep him in office have been nothing less than an ongoing coup that had unusually difficult hurdles, legal hurdles and so forth. And we know from people like Dennis Montgomery, who was involved in, as he says at least, in changing databases and doing things that basically have yet to come to light, but would be hugely impactful. That is, they would be impeachable offenses if we learned the kinds of things that Dennis Montgomery had to say. Right. But he's kept those things, or that is, those things that he knew and was contracted to do as a guy working for our intelligence community. The things he did were, in my opinion, very likely impeachable offenses. So if these things had come to light, it would have been a huge problem. And Fuddy was the key to this. That is, if she were to have to be deposed before any court's order, she might well talk. And I think that was a threat that kept these people wondering what they ought to do. So they pulled out probably some plan that had already long been put down on paper. And they got rid of her. They extracted her from real life and put her into sunsets with her feet in the sand and her family with lots of money. And there was a lot of reason to do that.
Well, let me just fill out Loretta Fuddy just a bit.
Yeah.
Some of your listeners probably haven't heard of the whole story here, but the deal with Loretta Fuddy was she belonged to a religious organization. It was, in fact, the U.S. director, I believe, for finance or something with that organization called Sabood. Sabood is an organization that has, locations around the world. They're sort of a pseudo-religious, non-religious organization. Amazingly, when Obama's mother, Stanley Ann Dunham, went to Indonesia and took Barry along, with her husband, Soetoro, at the time. I apologize, there's an aircraft going overhead. When she moved to Indonesia, she was part of this Sabood religious organization. Now, at the time, there was tremendous internal conflicts inside of Indonesia. And the then president in Indonesia, and this is about 1966 or so, at one point accused the Sabood organization of being a front operation for subversive activities against his government orchestrated by the CIA. And also Stanley Ann Dunham's work there. She's working for the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation was doing stuff for USAID. In '74, during the Church Committee hearings, the then director of the FBI during this period testified that related to these subversive activities against governments in various parts of the world, USAID, there was nobody working for USAID that wasn't essentially on the payroll of the CIA. He was talking specifically at that time the work that was going on in Chile and other areas in South America, but he was referring also in the broader sense that, yeah, everybody in USAID was on CIA's payroll because they were being used by us for eyes and ears, etc. So a reasonable argument could be made that Stanley Ann Dunham and her husband were involved in some type of activity, cover activity, both based on what we've had in testimony here in the United States from our officials and what was testimony over in Indonesia, or statements made in Indonesia at the time. Interestingly enough, so then we come forward, here is another Sabood, which most of your listeners have never even heard the name before, a very obscure, few thousand members in the whole world religious organization. And the person that's brought into office at the Hawaiian Department of Public Health is this Loretta Fuddy from Seattle. And even the circumstances in which she's brought into office are very unusual. All of a sudden, this person is there at the discretion of the governor. The guy who's been there, who's a doctor, who has all this experience, he suddenly steps down in the press conference that was, abruptly called, and everybody shows up, where he announces he's stepping down. One of the reporters asks him, well, why are you stepping down? He says, I don't know. The guy says he doesn't even know why he's stepping down. He's there to announce that he's stepping down. Well, I don't know. Why? Because he was told by the governor, get the heck out of here. And they bring in Loretta Fuddy and put her in place. And then a while later, this birth certificate is released. Well, what was the rest of the context in here? It was because Trump was saying, where's the birth certificate? We had signs on the side of the road that were billboards that people were hiring around the country. Where's the birth certificate? It was becoming a problem. And so in that context, in that broader context, Loretta Fuddy was brought in to fix this problem. And she has this history. We have pictures of Obama playing his guitar at Sabood things in Indonesia, this obscure little thing. This was an inside job between the players to protect the king. And so when they did this and put Loretta in there, it was with a plan. And suddenly, where the governor of Hawaii couldn't find the birth certificate, said he's going to release it, he doesn't have it. And then later, all of a sudden, she comes out with the birth certificate and releases it, supposedly to fix the problem. You know, it's like a miracle. And people were starting to ask questions. It was getting a little more intense. Those problems would have probably taken a long time to run through, but you still were at the early part of the second term of this presidency. They needed to kind of clean things up and eliminate some of the problems. And one thing I'll add to this, it is an interesting detail. The week that they released the birth certificate on April 27th, 5 days later, on May 2nd, they announced that this administration announces, with the president walking out, second time in a week, he's had a big news conference, walking out to announce that they had taken out Osama bin Laden. Well, what was that in part aimed at? I mean, they've had this Osama bin Laden card hanging out there in the balance for a very long time, and they suddenly, like a jack-in-the-box, pull the Osama bin Laden card out. And we've got Osama bin Laden. So that really overdrove the whole conversation about the birth certificate and kind of shut it down, because now it's all the attention on Osama bin Laden, and we've got him, and we buried him at sea, and all sorts of things. That all happened in a very tight space of days.
Wow. That makes sense. It really legitimized him all in one shot.
Well, and I would add this. So somebody, in our opinion, as we look at it, had a plan that was orchestrated to work together to both shut down the controversy over the birth certificate by releasing it, take the wind out of the sails of Trump. Remember, Trump was actually thought by many to be preparing to run in that election. And if he hadn't gotten shut down on this birth certificate issue with the release of the birth certificate, he may very well have run 4 years earlier. Then the second thing is that in the course of doing the Osama bin Laden release, that was all involving U.S. Navy SEALs. And then later, Extortion 17 happens, and the SEALs that were, possibly involved, some of them, we don't know the exact persons that were and weren't, but some of them were on Extortion 17 and died there just 3 months later. Why is this relevant? It's interesting that the military asset, the SEALs, are apparently involved in both operations. Certainly the SEALs sub was there at the Molokai event, and appears to us to be divers and diver equipment of a very specialized nature present. So at the end of the day, what are we really saying? We're saying that military assets, multi-billion-dollar military assets, were involved in this cover-up, the orchestration, the workup, and the cover-up of this crash involving Loretta Fuddy. And if you're using military assets, multi-billion-dollar military assets, for what amounts to a propaganda campaign, propagandizing the American people that Loretta Fuddy died here at this event, propagandizing the American people that the birth certificate was real in the first place, that kind of militarized propaganda, that's different than just a little lie from a politician or something like that. This is a very serious misapplication of our military assets for political gain, protection, etc. It's completely different than a little bit of somebody used a copy machine to copy a few things out and send them to voters here and there, and it was on government dime. A militarized disinformation propaganda campaign is essentially a military coup, is as far as I'm concerned, or the protection, the long ongoing protection, misuse of our military assets. If you make the leap and say that these military assets were used in this Loretta Fuddy cover-up, then you have to go back and go, what's the rest of the context of what's going on here that that applies. If that was the SEAL team, which it appears to be some of their equipment anyway, it might have been contractors in the water there at the water that were familiar with SEAL equipment, potentially. But it doesn't change the fact that you have aircraft overhead, some equipment in the water that's of a militarized nature with the fish. At the end of the day, what we're talking about here is using these military assets to propagandize the American people. And in an involved campaign, this didn't happen in one day. It took time to develop a scenario and then engineer it, to get a sub there, to get an aircraft there, to get all of this equipment there, to get the right divers there, to get the other people present.
Seal off
is
the
a
airspace,
very involved weeks, months strategy planning thing. That wasn't done by the SEALs, and it wasn't done by the US Navy, and it wasn't done by the Coast Guard or police people or even political hacks all by themselves. There's only one place in our entire structure where this type of planning is done for this type of an operation. The SEAL team enclosure on that sub is under the direction of and at the disposal of CIA. Why? Because the SEALs that are used, even though the Navy delivers that sub different places and delivers the SEAL different places, who's actually running those type of covert ops? That's CIA. So who wrote the script for this propaganda campaign involving Loretta Fuddy, bringing all of this equipment to this one location for this one little thing? And then I go back to, we're the same people writing the script when the decision was made to get Loretta Fuddy, who was accused, involved with an organization that was accused of being a front for the CIA down in Indonesia. Right. By the way, they have one of their offices here in the U.S. is just a mile or two down the street from Langley, Virginia.
And so Chicago.
And in Chicago, and in Hawaii, and in Seattle, where Stan Lee grew up, did high school. So the point is that we're looking at a very involved operation where military assets are used, but the planning, the orchestration, the sifting the right people in and out of the right positions to protect this player are C blanking A.
Now,
so can you say that this is a minor thing? You are being propagandized in a very complex operation, similar to what might be done against a foreign government to try and get your player in office to get your way using these assets. It's not just a militarized operation for the propaganda. It's the intelligence community being used in this operation against the American people. And who were the players that were involved and what was it for? What was the gain that was here to be had? And part of the reason, why do you have to have this specific person in office during this time period? Why is that? This specific person? Because from the outset, what was it that was the objective for President Obama? His first foreign trip was to Egypt. Remember when he said, hey, that guy looks like me? And he goes and announces a new strategy for the Mideast. Well, we know now, all these 8-10 years later, that that new strategy for the Mideast involved reshaping which governments were in power, bringing in Muslim Brotherhood, tearing down other governments, and going after Syria. That was the reason why they went into Libya and used Libya like an arms depot, sucked all of the stuff out of it, used it as an exchange point for guns and weapons that were on their bills of lading supposed to be going to Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and they were transshipping them onto other boats and going up to Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey in preparation to go into Syria, which they tried to get us into a boots on the ground war in Syria 6 times during this administration. And fortunately, we were able to dodge that bullet, at least up until recently. And so the whole point is they had to have this person in office to complete that Mideast strategy. Who was orchestrating that strategy? Whose advantage was it for? Remember, who became director of the CIA? Where did he come from?
The Navy.
No, I'm also talking about Brennan.
Oh yeah, I forgot about Brennan. Yes, yes,
And
yes.
where was he at? He was station chief there in Saudi Arabia. What does
Right.
this whole Mideast operation that we've been watching for the last many years favor? It favors Saudi Arabia and at that time Qatar and other governments in there that they could break up Syria because other pipelines across and guarantee they had oil supply to Europe, a customer locked in for the next 50, 100 years. This was hugely important with trillions of dollars over the next many decades and decades on the line. So the idea of protecting this player being in office during this time period, it's not a minor thing, and it wasn't trivial amounts of money that were on the table. This was for all the marbles.
Yeah.
Remember, Saudi Arabia, we created Saudi Arabia. It's a branch office of our intelligence community, if you want to get right back down to it, because we're the ones that put those people in power and kept them there during this whole time. They're there. You know, people think Saudi Arabia is running us. No, we're running them.
Correct. All right, John, we got about 2 minutes left. Hugo, why don't you plug the rest of the details of your book and how people could get it? Go ahead.
Well, it's available online. It's at www.thefuddyhoax.com. You can place your order there. There's paper versions, that is the book, physical book, or you can also get an electronic download. And very shortly, you'll be able to get it from Amazon as a Kindle kind of thing as well. But go to www.thefuddyhoax, just written together, and you'll see it there. It's a 415-page book. It's exhaustive, I've been told. It's very well documented. It's got hundreds of color pictures. And I think people come away saying, oh my goodness, this really did happen that way. So it's something that I think all of us should have in our quiver and understanding as we move forward, because these things are accelerating and we may be called upon to do all kinds of things that we never thought we would be doing.
Yes, absolutely.
This is about the next war that we're getting sucked into and the setup that got us there. And if you don't understand what was the motivation, the players involved, and the setup, you don't understand the deep state. And when you look at what the momentum is against Trump, against this administration, trying to continue to force us down this path to this next huge Iraq, Vietnam, whatever you want to call it, Korea, something that's going to take a very long time to get sorted through. These players were highly motivated and they haven't gone away.
Yeah, a lot of people might be tempted to think this is 3.5-year-old news, and Fuddy, well, she's been gone and we don't care. But this is still unfinished business. The people that were doing these things are still in power and able to bring submarines wherever they want today.
In the deep state. And then let me add this also. It's not old news because the players, including the former president, have not stepped off the stage. They are continuing to influence events. So knowing what they were up to and what was done and what is at stake is still critical. They haven't gone away. They are still pursuing and using their deep state power to accomplish things in order to propagandize and move the American people to do their bidding. We're really talking about, is the U.S. deep state a captured operation? And if it is captured, by whom, for what purposes, to what ends?
Yeah. Thank you both for joining us on this important broadcast. Folks, go get the book. This is a far-reaching conspiracy and probably a very key linchpin of one of the most important events in U.S. history, especially surrounding a sitting president at that time. thefuddyhoax.com. Get it today. With that being said, thank you all again. And CJ, take it away.